The October morning air in Glacier Valley, Montana, carried the crisp bite of approaching winter as Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her dusty pickup truck. The silence was overwhelming after 3 decades of Chicago's constant urban symphony. Here, only the whisper of wind through tall pines and the distant call of a hawk broke the profound quiet that stretched across the rolling hills and meadows. Sarah pulled her worn leather gloves tighter and surveyed the 20-acre plot that had belonged to her grandmother, Eleanor. The old woman had lived here until she was 92, in a small cabin that had since fallen into disrepair. Sarah had spent summers here as a child, but those memories felt like they belonged to someone else entirely, someone who hadn't spent the last year navigating a bitter divorce, someone who hadn't watched her marriage crumble despite her best efforts to save it. The skeletal remains of Eleanor's cabin stood like a monument to better times, its roof partially collapsed and walls weathered grey. But Sarah wasn't here to restore the old structure. She was here to build something entirely new, something that would be completely hers. She walked to the clearing she had marked out during her first visit 6 weeks ago, where neat stacks of logs waited. Each Douglas fir log had been carefully selected and delivered by the local lumber mill. Sarah ran her hand along the smooth bark of the nearest log, feeling the solid weight of her decision. The foundation was already poured, concrete pillars rising from the earth like promises of stability she desperately needed. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, the same mantra that had gotten her through law school, through building her architectural firm, through the painful dissolution of everything she thought her life would be. The sound of an engine broke her concentration. Through the trees, she could see the silhouette of a man on horseback, moving slowly along the fence line that bordered her property. The Brennan Ranch, she remembered from the property documents. Her closest neighbor, though at this distance, close, was relative. Sarah had glimpsed him twice before, once at the hardware store in town and once at the diner, but they hadn't spoken. He was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who worked outdoors. The locals had mentioned he was a widower, raising his daughter alone since his wife's death 3 years ago. Beyond that, people seemed to respect his privacy, and Sarah appreciated that discretion. Privacy was exactly what she had come here seeking. She turned back to her logs, pulling on her work gloves with renewed determination. The cabin plans were memorized. She had drawn them herself, a modest 200-square-foot structure with a stone fireplace, wide front porch, and large windows to capture the mountain views. Simple, functional, beautiful, everything her life in Chicago had failed to be. The first log was the heaviest, serving as the foundation sill. Sarah had practiced this maneuver dozens of times in her mind, but the reality was more challenging. The log was 24 feet long and weighed nearly 300 pounds. She had rigged a system of pulleys and ramps, determined to prove she could handle this alone. As she maneuvered the log using the come-along winch, sweat began to bead on her forehead, despite the cool morning air. Her arms ached, and her back protested, but each inch of progress felt like a victory. This physical exhaustion was honest, purposeful, so different from the mental fatigue that had consumed her final months in Chicago. "Come on," she grunted, adjusting her grip on the cant hook, a tool that had become as familiar as a pen in her architect's hand. The log shifted, rolling into position with a satisfying thud. From across the meadow, she caught another glimpse of the horseman. He had stopped and appeared to be watching, though at this distance she couldn't be sure. Part of her wanted to wave, to acknowledge his presence, but uncertainty held her back. She had come here to escape complications, not create new ones. The morning progressed with steady rhythm. Log by log, Sarah began to see her vision taking shape. Each piece fit precisely according to her calculations. The notches she had carefully cut, allowing the logs to lock together like pieces of an enormous puzzle. Her hands, soft from years of desk work, were developing calluses. Her shoulders, accustomed to hunching over drafting tables, were learning to carry weight differently. By noon, she had successfully placed 6 logs, creating the foundation for 2 walls. The sense of accomplishment was profound, more satisfying than any architectural award she had received, more meaningful than any client's praise. This was creation in its purest form. She sat on one of the completed walls, unwrapping the sandwich she had packed that morning. The view from here was breathtaking. Rolling hills carpeted in golden aspen and deep green pine, with the jagged peaks of the Rockies rising in the distance like ancient guardians. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with effortless grace. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something approaching peace. The constant anxiety that had plagued her final year of marriage was absent. There were no phones ringing with emergencies, No meetings demanding her immediate attention, no arguments waiting at home, just her, the logs, and the vast Montana sky. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. The rider was closer now, moving along the dirt road that bordered her property. She could see him more clearly. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. A black and white border collie trotted alongside, tongue lolling in apparent contentment. As he reached the point nearest to her building site, he slowed and then stopped entirely. For a long moment they simply looked at each other across the 50 yards that separated them. Sarah raised her hand in a tentative wave. After a moment's hesitation, he touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement before continuing on his way. The brief interaction left Sarah with an unexpected flutter of curiosity. There had been something in that moment, a recognition perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement of two people choosing solitude in this vast landscape. She found herself wondering about his story, about the loss that had brought him to this same quiet refuge. But those thoughts were dangerous territory. She had come here to rebuild herself, not to get entangled in someone else's complications. The cabin would be her focus, her salvation, her proof that she could create something lasting and beautiful with her own hands. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains, Sarah returned to her work. 3 more logs found their places, each one bringing her closer to walls that would shelter her through the coming winter. Her body ached in ways she had forgotten were possible, but it was a good ache, the kind that spoke of progress and purpose. The October evening painted the sky in shades of amber and rose as Sarah finally called it a day. She stood back to admire her progress, her cabin rising from the earth 1 log at a time, solid and real and entirely hers. Tomorrow, she would continue. Log by log, day by day, she would build not just a cabin, but a new life. The second week of construction brought challenges Sarah hadn't anticipated. A storm had rolled through Glacier Valley during the night, leaving the morning air sharp with the scent of rain and pine. Her carefully stacked logs were now scattered across the building site, some having rolled down the gentle slope toward the creek that bordered her property. Sarah stood in her rain boots, surveying the damage with a mixture of frustration and determination. The walls she had built so carefully were intact, but progress had definitely been set back. She pulled her wool hat down over her ears and began the tedious process of retrieving the displaced logs. The first log she attempted to move had rolled into a depression filled with muddy water. As she struggled with the cant hook, trying to gain leverage on the slippery surface, her boots began to sink into the soft earth. The more she struggled, the deeper she sank, until she was ankle-deep in cold mud with a 300-pound log that refused to budge. "This is exactly what Eleanor would have told me to expect," Sarah muttered, thinking of her grandmother's practical wisdom. Eleanor had built her first cabin during the Depression with nothing but determination and borrowed tools. If she could do it then, I can do it now. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted her internal pep talk. A dark blue pickup truck was making its way down the dirt road, slowing as it approached her driveway. Sarah's heart rate quickened. She hadn't been expecting anyone, and her nearest neighbor in town was still 15 miles away. The truck stopped at the edge of her property, and the driver's door opened. It was the rancher she had seen on horseback, Jake Brennan. Up close, she could see he was perhaps in his late 30s, with sandy brown hair that needed a trim, and green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His jeans and flannel shirt were worn but clean, and he moved with the unhurried confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. "Morning," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "Looks like the storm gave you some trouble." Sarah felt suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. Mud-splattered jeans, rain-soaked jacket, and hair escaping from under her knit cap. "Nothing I can't handle," she replied, perhaps a bit more defensively than she intended. Jake approached slowly, hands in his pockets giving her space. "I'm Jake Brennan. I own the ranch next door." He gestured toward the west, where she could see a cluster of buildings in the distance. "Thought I should introduce myself properly, seeing as we're neighbors." "Sarah Mitchell," she responded, attempting to extract herself from the mud with as much dignity as possible. "I inherited this land from my grandmother, Eleanor." "Eleanor was a good woman," Jake said, and something in his tone suggested genuine respect rather than empty politeness. "She used to bring my wife—" He paused, a shadow crossing his features. "She used to bring Emma and me fresh eggs when she had extras." Good neighbor. Sarah managed to free herself from the mud with an ungraceful squelch. "I remember her talking about the neighbors, but I was just a kid during my summer visits. Everything seemed much simpler then." "Some things still are simple," Jake said, his gaze moving to the partially built cabin. "That's a solid foundation you've got there. Eleanor would be proud to see someone building on this land again." There was something in his tone that made Sarah look at him more carefully. His compliment felt genuine, not patronizing, and she realized he was looking at her work with the eye of someone who understood construction. "You know about building?" she asked. "Some. Had to learn when I took over the ranch from my father. Built most of the outbuildings myself over the years." He nodded toward the scattered logs. "Storms can be tricky. Ground gets soft, logs get heavy. Sometimes you need a different approach." Sarah bristled slightly. "I appreciate the observation, but I've got it figured out." Jake held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Not doubting that for a second. Just thought you might want to know there's a logging winch in my barn that's not being used. Eleanor borrowed it once when she was fixing her fence line. You're welcome to it if it would help." The offer caught Sarah off guard. In Chicago, neighbors barely acknowledged each other, much less offered to lend expensive equipment to strangers. "That's very generous, but I don't want to be a bother." "No bother," Jake said simply. "Truth is, it's good to see this place being used again." Eleanor's land has been too quiet. Before Sarah could respond, a school bus appeared on the main road, yellow against the gray morning sky. Jake checked his watch and stepped back toward his truck. "That'll be Emma coming home," he said. "My daughter. She gets off at the end of our drive." He paused, one hand on the truck door. "The offer stands about the winch, and if you need anything else, well, out here we help each other. It's just how things work." As he drove away, Sarah found herself watching until his truck disappeared behind the trees. The brief encounter had left her feeling oddly unsettled, not uncomfortable exactly, but aware that her carefully constructed solitude had been gently challenged. She returned to the problem of the scattered logs with renewed energy. Using the techniques she had learned from YouTube videos and construction manuals, she managed to free the stuck log from its muddy prison. The work was harder alone, but she had expected that. What she hadn't expected was how Jake's simple offer of help had made her realize how isolated she had become. The afternoon brought clearer skies and better progress. Sarah managed to retrieve all the displaced logs and even added 2 more courses to her walls. As she worked, she found herself glancing occasionally toward the Brennan Ranch, wondering about Jake's life there. She had noticed he wore no wedding ring, and his brief mention of his wife suggested loss rather than divorce. The thought of raising a child alone while managing a ranch seemed overwhelming. As evening approached, Sarah was securing her tools in the small trailer she used for storage when she heard the sound of a child's laughter carried on the wind. Through the trees, she could see 2 figures in the distance, a man and a small girl, working together near what appeared to be a vegetable garden. Even from this distance, she could sense the easy affection between them. The scene stirred something in Sarah she thought she had buried along with her marriage. Michael had never wanted children, always finding reasons to postpone that conversation. Now, watching Jake with his daughter, she wondered what it would be like to have that kind of simple, uncomplicated love in her life. She shook off the thought and focused on her evening routine. Hot tea, a simple dinner, and planning tomorrow's work by the light of her Coleman lantern. The cabin was beginning to feel real, no longer just an idea or an escape, but an actual home taking shape, log by log. As she prepared for bed in her small RV, Sarah reflected on the day's unexpected encounter. Jake Brennan seemed like a decent man dealing with his own challenges. His offer of help had been genuine, without strings or expectations. In Chicago, she would have been suspicious of such generosity, but here in Montana, it felt different. It felt like something Eleanor would have understood and appreciated. Tomorrow, she would continue building, one log at a time. And maybe, if the morning brought another equipment problem, she would consider walking over to the Brennan Ranch to take a look at that winch. The thought didn't feel like giving up her independence. It felt like learning how to be a good neighbor. 3 days after her encounter with Jake, Sarah found herself standing at the fence line that separated her property from the Brennan Ranch. The morning was crisp, with frost still clinging to the grass despite the October sun. She had wrestled with her pride for those 3 days, but practicality had finally won. The logging winch would cut her work time in half, and winter was approaching faster than she had anticipated. The ranch spread before her in neat, purposeful order. A large 2-story farmhouse painted white with green shutters sat at the center, surrounded by barns, corrals, and outbuildings that spoke of generations of careful maintenance. Cattle dotted the pastures, and she could see horses in a fenced paddock near the main barn. Everything had the look of a place where people worked hard and took pride in their efforts. As she approached the house, a border collie came trotting around the corner, tail wagging in cautious greeting. This must be the dog she had seen with Jake during his rides. "Hello there," Sarah said softly, extending her hand for the dog to sniff. "Are you the welcoming committee?" "That's Rex," came a small voice from behind her. Sarah turned to see a girl of perhaps 8 years old peering around the corner of the house. She had her father's green eyes and sandy hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "He's friendly, but Dad says he's supposed to bark at strangers." "Well, I guess he decided I'm not too strange," Sarah replied with a smile. "You must be Emma. I'm Sarah, your new neighbor." Emma stepped fully into view, wearing jeans and a purple sweater that had seen better days. "Dad said you're building a cabin all by yourself. Is that true?" "It is true," Sarah confirmed, "though I have to admit, it's harder than I expected." "Dad builds things too," Emma said with obvious pride. "He built my treehouse and the new chicken coop and fixed the roof on the barn after the big storm last spring." She paused, studying Sarah with the direct gaze children use when deciding whether adults are worth their trust. "Why are you building it by yourself? Don't you have anyone to help you?" The innocent question hit closer to home than Sarah had expected. "Sometimes it's good to know you can do things on your own," she said carefully. "It makes you feel strong." Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense. "That's what Dad says about learning to ride by yourself. You have to fall off a few times, but then you know you can do it." The sound of footsteps on gravel announced Jake's approach. He emerged from the barn carrying a feed bucket, his expression shifting from surprise to something warmer when he saw Sarah and Emma talking. "Morning," he called out, setting down the bucket and walking over to join them. "Emma, you're supposed to be getting ready for school." "I am ready," Emma protested, "and Sarah's here. She came to visit." "Actually," Sarah said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks, "I came to ask about that winch you mentioned, if the offer still stands." Jake's smile was immediate and genuine. "Of course it stands. Emma, go grab your backpack. The bus will be here in 15 minutes. Emma scampered toward the house and Rex followed, leaving Sarah and Jake alone in the morning quiet. Without Emma's chatter, Sarah became aware of how peaceful the ranch felt. Busy but not frantic, purposeful but not rushed. "Let me show you the winch," Jake said, leading her toward one of the larger barns. "Fair warning, it's older than dirt, but it works well enough." The barn interior was organized chaos, tools, equipment, and supplies arranged in a way that clearly made sense to someone who used them regularly. The winch sat in one corner, a heavy mechanical device that looked like it could pull a truck out of a ditch. "This should handle your logs without any trouble," Jake explained, demonstrating the controls. "The truck can pull it, and these chains will give you the leverage you need. Just remember to check the load limits." As he spoke, Sarah found herself watching his hands as much as listening to his words. They were working hands, calloused and scarred, but careful and precise. When he looked up and caught her staring, she quickly redirected her attention to the equipment. "This is incredibly generous," she said. "How much should I pay you for the rental?" Jake looked genuinely puzzled. "Pay me?" "Sarah, neighbors don't charge neighbors for help. That's not how things work around here." The comment stung, though she knew he hadn't meant it to. "I'm sorry, I'm not used to..." She struggled for the right words. "In Chicago, everything has a price. I guess I'm still learning how things work here." Jake's expression softened. "Eleanor mentioned you lived in the city. Must be quite a change moving out here." "That's putting it mildly," Sarah admitted. "But it's a good change. I needed something different." Before Jake could respond, Emma came running back from the house, backpack bouncing against her shoulders. "Dad, can Sarah come for dinner sometime? We never have company, and I want to show her my rock collection." The invitation hung in the air between them, simple and complicated at the same time. Sarah saw Jake's slight hesitation, not rudeness, but the caution of someone who had learned to be careful with his heart. "Emma, Sarah's probably busy with her building," Jake said gently. "Actually," Sarah heard herself saying, "dinner sounds nice. I've been living on sandwiches and canned soup for weeks." Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? Can you come tonight? Dad makes the best spaghetti, and I can show you my fossils too." Sarah looked at Jake, trying to read his expression. "Only if it's not too much trouble." "No trouble," Jake said, though something in his voice suggested he was as surprised by the invitation as she was. "Emma's right about the spaghetti. 6:30 work for you?" "Perfect," Sarah agreed, wondering what she had just gotten herself into. The school bus honked from the main road, and Emma took off running, calling back over her shoulder, "Don't forget, 6:30! Left alone with Jake, Sarah felt suddenly awkward. The easy conversation had been replaced by an awareness that they had just crossed some invisible line from neighbors to something more personal. "I should probably get that winch loaded," Jake said, filling the silence. "Give me a hand?" They worked together to load the equipment into his truck, their conversation limited to practical matters: how to operate the controls, where to position it for maximum effectiveness, safety precautions to remember. But Sarah was aware of their proximity as they maneuvered the heavy equipment, of the competent way Jake handled the task, of the comfortable rhythm they fell into without discussion. When the winch was secured in her pickup, Jake stepped back and wiped his hands on a shop rag. "That should make your work easier, and Sarah?" He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "Thanks for saying yes to dinner." Emma doesn't get much chance to show off her collections. As Sarah drove back to her property, the winch securely fastened in her truck bed, she realized that accepting the dinner invitation had felt as natural as breathing. For the first time since her divorce, she was looking forward to an evening that didn't involve construction manuals or solitary meals. The thought should have worried her more than it did. The dinner at the Brennan house had been a revelation. Sarah arrived precisely at 6:30, carrying a bottle of wine she had driven 20 miles to purchase and a small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered from her property. Emma had greeted her at the door with unbridled enthusiasm, immediately launching into a detailed tour of the house while Jake finished cooking. The farmhouse interior was warm and lived in, with family photos covering the mantelpiece and Emma's artwork displayed prominently on the refrigerator. There were signs everywhere of a man raising a daughter alone, mismatched dish towels, a stack of picture books on the coffee table, and small pink hair ties scattered on various surfaces. But there was also an underlying order and care that spoke of genuine effort to create a loving home. Now 3 weeks later, as Sarah hammered the final shingle onto her cabin roof, she reflected on how that evening had changed everything. Emma had indeed shown her the rock collection, along with fossils, pressed flowers, and a detailed explanation of why horses were better than any other animal on Earth. Jake had been quietly attentive, refilling wine glasses and watching with obvious pleasure as his daughter charmed their guest. The easy conversation over spaghetti had stretched long into the evening. Sarah found herself talking about her grandmother Eleanor, her failed marriage, and her decision to leave Chicago. Jake had shared stories about inheriting the ranch, the challenges of single parenthood, and the quiet satisfaction of working land that had been in his family for 3 generations. What struck Sarah most was how natural it all felt. There had been no awkward silences, no careful dancing around difficult topics. Emma had fallen asleep, curled against Sarah's side while they looked at photo albums, and neither adult had felt compelled to wake her immediately. "There," Sarah announced to the empty October sky, driving the last nail into place. "Finished." She climbed down from the ladder and stepped back to survey her completed cabin. The structure stood solid and welcoming against the backdrop of golden aspens and evergreens. The wide front porch she had envisioned was perfect for morning coffee and evening reflection. Large windows would capture the mountain views and fill the interior with natural light. The stone chimney promised warmth during the long Montana winters, but most importantly, it was hers. Every log, every joint, every decision had been made by her hands and her will. The sense of accomplishment was profound, but it was tempered by an unexpected realization. She no longer wanted to enjoy this achievement alone. The sound of approaching vehicles drew her attention. Jake's truck was leading a small convoy that included Emma bouncing in the passenger seat, followed by 3 other pickups she recognized from town. As they parked near her cabin, Sarah felt a flutter of nervous excitement. "Surprise!" Emma called out, tumbling from the truck before it had fully stopped. "Dad said your cabin was finished, so we brought a celebration." Jake emerged more slowly, carrying a large cooler. Behind him, Sarah recognized Tom and Helen from the hardware store, Doc Peterson, who ran the local veterinary clinic, and Maria Santos, who owned the diner in town. They were all carrying something: food, drinks, or tools. "Hope you don't mind the invasion," Jake said with a grin that made Sarah's heart skip. "Word gets around fast in a small community, and folks wanted to see what you'd built." "I can't believe you organized this," Sarah said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Actually," Jake admitted, "it was Emma's idea. She said you needed a proper housewarming party." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The impromptu gathering had the feel of an old-fashioned barn raising. Tom and Doc Peterson helped Sarah move her furniture from the RV into the cabin, arranging pieces with the efficiency of men who had done this before. Helen and Maria unpacked enough food to feed twice their number, transforming Sarah's small kitchen table into a feast. Emma appointed herself official tour guide, leading everyone through the cabin with detailed explanations of each room's purpose and Sarah's building techniques. Her pride was infectious, and Sarah found herself glowing under the child's enthusiastic praise. "This is the living room where Sarah's going to put her books," Emma announced, "and this is the kitchen where she's going to learn to make better coffee than the stuff she drinks now." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Jake started a fire in Sarah's new stone fireplace. The group gathered in the living room, conversation flowing easily between neighbors who had known each other for years and the newcomer who was rapidly becoming part of their community. "You've built something special here," Doc Peterson said, raising his beer bottle in a toast. "Eleanor would be proud." "To new beginnings," Helen added, and everyone joined the toast. As the evening wound down and the guests prepared to leave, Sarah found herself reluctant to see them go. The cabin felt different with people in it. Not just shelter, but a true home filled with laughter and friendship. Emma had fallen asleep in one of the comfortable chairs by the fire, and Jake carefully lifted her into his arms. "We should head home," he said quietly. "Early morning tomorrow." Sarah walked them to the door, Emma stirring slightly in her father's arms. At the threshold, Jake paused. "Sarah, I want you to know—" He struggled for words, then seemed to find his courage. "This community, we've all watched you work these past months. What you've accomplished here, it's not just about building a cabin. You've built yourself a place to belong." The simple statement carried weight beyond its words. Sarah felt tears threaten, but they were good tears, tears of gratitude and recognition. "I couldn't have done it without help," she said, looking directly into his eyes. "Without good neighbors." "Well," Jake said with a smile that held promise of future conversations, "lucky for you, we're not going anywhere." After everyone left, Sarah stood alone in her completed cabin. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and through her large windows, she could see the lights of the Brennan Ranch twinkling in the distance. The sight filled her with a contentment she hadn't expected. She had come to Montana to build a cabin and escape the pain of her failed marriage. She had succeeded in both goals, but somewhere along the way she had discovered something more valuable. She had found her way back to believing in the possibility of family, community, and love. The cabin stood solid around her, every log a testament to her determination and independence, but it was more than that now. It was the foundation for whatever came next, a place where Emma could continue showing off her collections, where Jake might share more quiet conversations by the fire, where neighbors would always be welcome. Outside, snow began to fall, the first of the season dusting the completed roof and settling on the windowsills. Sarah made herself a cup of tea and settled into her chair by the fire, watching the flakes dance in the light from her windows. She had built her cabin one log at a time. Now she was ready to build the rest of her life the same way, carefully, purposefully, and with the patience to let good things grow in their own time. Some constructions, she realized, required more than one person's hands to reach completion. The thought no longer frightened her. It felt like coming home.